deficit and our debt, and that would be entitlement programs.
The Cut, Cap, and Balance group has come out against your plan. Do you think you can get a majority of Republicans to vote for it in the House?
I thank the Speaker for yielding.
The yeas are 100.
We have just laid it out to our members. We believe that we...
Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore votes aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 175, the nays are 237. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Huelskamp, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Huelskamp of Kansas.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
3 more amendment votes after this one. This amendment offered by Representative Huelskamp of Kansas. It would reduce funds on the bill by $3 billion. The Associated Press writing that the White House has already rejected a plan similar to the one that House Speaker Boehner unveiled today. We heard the Speaker talking about it just a moment ago. It would provide an immediate $1 trillion increase in the government's debt limit in exchange for $1.2 trillion in cuts in federal spending. The President will make remarks in the East Room of the White House about the debt negotiations. Our live coverage will be on C-SPAN 2 or here on C-SPAN if the House is out.
4. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, on which the further proceedings were postponed and in which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Cleaver of Missouri.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request, a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
Amendment voting continues here in the House. Debate on the Interior and Environment spending bill is expected to last through this week and possibly into next week. Here's how the Associated Press is writing today about the debt talks. Senate Democrats and House Republicans are pushing rival plans to reduce future budget deficits and avert a potential government default next week. Neither plan raises taxes or cuts major benefit programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. White House Press Secretary Jay Carney released a statement today supporting Senator Reid's plan that would cut $2.7 trillion in government spending over 10 years. We're going to have President Obama speaking live from the White House tonight at 9 Eastern on C-SPAN 2 or here on C-SPAN if the House is out.
248. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on an amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond, on which further proceedings were postponed, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Richmond of Louisiana.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
This amendment, offered by Representative Richmond of Louisiana, would increase funds for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management by $5 million and decrease the Bureau of Land Management by $6 million. One more amendment vote expected tonight after this one. After these votes, a debate on a few bills, including a measure to extend FBI Director Robert Mueller's term until September 4th of next year.
vote, the ayes are 221, the nays are 192. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Hochul, on which further proceedings were postponed, on which the noes prevailed by a voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Hochul of New York.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
This is the last vote of the day. Today, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and House Speaker John Boehner outlined different plans to address the debt ceiling spending issue. Here's a reporter with an update. Michael Crittenden of Dow Jones Newswires, how do the plans offered by House Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Reid compare?
Well, you sort of have two different approaches, and obviously this is probably not the last we've heard of new plans this week. I mean, the Boehner plans, the big thing takeaway is it's sort of a two-step process. First, there's some, immediately cuts discretionary by $1.2 trillion over 10 years. That's the immediate step one. It would raise the debt ceiling through early next year. And then there's the second step where basically you have a commission of lawmakers to find an additional $1.8 trillion in spending cuts over the next 10 years. And if those cuts were subsequently approved, then the debt limit would be raised through the end of 2012, which is one of the requirements the White House has insisted on. Now, the Reid plan from Senate Majority Harry Reid, that's $2.7 trillion as opposed to the $3 trillion sort of envisioned under Boehner's plan. No revenue increases, and a lot of those savings would be from ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. About $1 trillion would, about $1.2 trillion in cuts to discretionary spending, and it would raise the debt ceiling through next year. So you sort of have these competing approaches.
So what are the prospects for getting those measures through?
I mean, it changes by the minute up here. The president already in the last 20 minutes has sort of changed the dynamic. He's giving a big address to the nation tonight, which, is bound to sort of change the thought process. Republicans exiting, House Republicans exiting a caucus meeting a little while ago said they were generally positive, but the big thing is details. I mean, even members of the House GOP caucus were leaving this meeting with leadership saying, it looks good, but we have to see the details of the Boehner plan. So, I mean, you have a lot of these sketches and outlines coming out, frameworks, and it's sort of like people are just trying to, put a piece here, put a piece there, trying to cobble something together on both sides of the aisle.
You mentioned the president, his address tonight. Where do the negotiations stand between Congress and the White House?
Well, I mean, the administration would tell you they're ongoing, and they're available to talk. It's interesting. Basically, every other day you sort of see a splintering of one negotiating group. At the end of last week, it really looked like Obama and Boehner were reaching an accord with Reid, sort of, and the Senate Democrats sort of left outside. Over the weekend, obviously, that changed again. So right now, I mean, it's really up in the air. I think that's one of the reasons the president's gonna give this address is sort of to lay out, and obviously he wants to, sort of take ownership as this sort of comes together.
Michael Crittenden of Dow Jones Newswires, appreciate your time.
Happy to.
And the president will speak about the debt talks, and Speaker Boehner will respond to the president. Our live coverage and your phone calls getting underway starting at 9 Eastern on C-SPAN 2 or here on C-SPAN if the House is out.
271. The nays are 271. The amendment is not adopted. For what purpose does the gentleman from Idaho rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
That's for you to take down there.
Go ahead.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 2584 and has come to no resolution thereon. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privilege report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
Clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 370, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 1938 to direct the President to expedite the consideration and approval of the construction and operation of the Keystone XL oil pipeline and for other purposes.
Referred to the House calendar and ordered printed. The House will be in order. Will the members please take their conversation outside the chambers? Members, please clear the well and take your conversations outside. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on the motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote of the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Record votes on proposed questions will be taken later. The House will be in order. The gentleman from Texas seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass S. 1103, a bill to extend the term of the incumbent director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 1103, an act to extend the term of the incumbent director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, and the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on S. 1103 currently under consideration.
So ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this September 11th marks the 10-year anniversary of the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history. America is fortunate not to have suffered another attack of such magnitude and devastation in the past decade.
The House will be in order. Please take your conversations outside the chambers. Continue.
America has remained safe, but not because those who are determined to deny us our freedoms and destroy our way of life have given up. We are safe because of the men and women who serve our country with devotion and distinction, those who serve in our armed forces, our intelligence community, and our law enforcement agencies. These public servants and their families make tremendous sacrifices to keep us safe and to keep terrorists on the run. Their work is often unrecognized and underappreciated. In addition to ensuring that terrorists are denied victory, some of our public servants also protect us from crime and ensure that justice is served. The agency that is charged with this unique duty is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI director is limited to a 10-year non-renewable term. Congress imposed this restriction to ensure political independence and to act as a restraint on unbridled power and the potential for misuse of that power. In just a few weeks, the current FBI director, Robert S. Mueller III, will conclude his 10-year term. The President has asked for a one-time 2-year extension for Mr. Mueller to ensure continuity in America's national security team. The killing of Osama bin Laden and personnel changes in key national security posts make these unusual times that justify a short-term extension. Director Mueller has shown himself a dedicated public servant who has kept terrorists at bay and reduced crime. Mr. Mueller assumed leadership of the FBI on September 4, 2001, just 1 week prior to the attacks of September 11, 2001. During his tenure, he has reformed the FBI to ensure that it is able to address not only terrorist threats, but also threats posed by traditional criminals. This request for an extension was not made by Mr. Mueller, but by the President of the United States. Mr. Mueller has agreed to accept this extension if it is approved by Congress. It's not every day that the House, the Senate, and the White House can agree, but this is something we all can agree is essential. This bill creates a new, one-time only, 2-year term of service for the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Mueller would be eligible to be appointed to this new term of service with the advice and consent of the Senate. The Senate will hold a confirmation vote after the President signs this bill. This new term would expire on September 4, 2013, after which Mr. Mueller would no longer serve as Director. This bill does not prevent the President from appointing a different individual to a new 10-year term by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. If the President wants to continue the services of the incumbent, this bill allows that to happen for a limited time and in a constitutional manner. I urge my colleagues to support this bill to continue the service of FBI Director Robert S. Mueller III for an additional 2 years. Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Mr. Conyers from Michigan, recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. I am pleased to join with the chairman of the committee in support of the Senate bill that would allow for the extension of the term of the FBI Director Robert Mueller, whose 10-year term expires on August the 2nd. Now, on May the 12th of this year, President Obama announced his desire to extend that term by 2 years. At the time, the President said, and I quote, "In his 10 years at the FBI, Bob Mueller has set the gold standard for leading the Bureau. Given the ongoing threats facing the United States, as well as the leadership transitions at other agencies, like the Defense Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, I believe continuity and stability at the FBI is critical at this time." I agree with the President's remarks, and I'm confident that Director Mueller will continue to work with integrity and respect for Americans' rights as he ensures the safety of the American people. The nation needs now, as much as at any time in our history, an FBI capable of a multifaceted mission to best protect us from a variety of criminal threats, which has been proven under Mueller's leadership. I congratulate him on his noteworthy 10-year term and look forward to continuing to work with him and with the Committee on the Judiciary. The job of the Federal Bureau of Investigation is critical, and that agency must have experienced and capable leadership. There are many threats which the FBI must concentrate its limited resources on, ranging from interstate violent crime, organized crime, human trafficking, exploitation of children, corporate fraud, mortgage fraud, cybercrime, and domestic terrorism. As time advances, so does the demands we place on the FBI and its agents across the country. We appreciate the difficulty the Director must face when determining how to allocate resources. As these demands grow and the nature of threats evolve, I hope the FBI will maintain an appropriate degree of focus on the types of crime that impact average Americans every day, whether it be fraud against seniors, corporate officers defrauding investors, civil rights violations by those who abuse power, theft of individual identities, or electronic intrusions into people's privacy. Director Mueller is the right person to continue to lead the Federal Bureau of Investigation in confronting these challenges at this time. He's proven himself to be honest, frank, and committed to the rule of law. While this extension is unusual, it is important that we grant it so that we have continuity in the leadership of the FBI at this critical time. I urge support of this important measure, and since we have no other requests for time, I'm prepared. What do you want? I will, if the chair permits, I'll yield 2 minutes to our distinguished member from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much,
Gentlelady
Mr.
from
Chairman.
Texas is recognized.
I thank you. I asked to address the House. As a member of the Homeland Security Committee, I want to join my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, which I also serve, to note the uniqueness of our times. There's a point that I think is very important about the continuity of the existing FBI Director, Mr. Mueller, and that is that we live not only in dangerous times, but we also live in times where resources are being strained. Questions are being raised about the resources necessary for law enforcement, and certainly a leader who understands the broad needs of the American public and the collaborative needs, collaborating with other law enforcement because of past experiences, is very important. Mr. Mueller, in his 10 years, has had collaborative efforts with all of the law enforcement, federal law enforcement agencies, and has opened up a dialogue between local and state law enforcement agencies. Just ask New York to tell you how important that is. Ask Texas, a number of our other large states with assets that are in the eye of the storm of potential terrorist acts. So I join with my colleagues and acknowledge the leadership of the President for asking the FBI Director to stay for 2 extra years, and that this does not undermine the 10-year term that is by law. And I ask colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Speaker, we have no further requests for time. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Michigan yields back. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, we have no request for additional time, and I'll yield back the balance of my time as well.
Okay, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 1103? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being the affirmative, the rules are suspended and the bill is passed. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and concur with the Senate amendment to H.R. 1383 as amended.
The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1383, an act to temporarily preserve higher rates for tuition and fees for programs of education at non-public institutions of higher learning pursued by individuals enrolled in the post-9/11 Educational Assistance Program of the Department of Veterans Affairs before the enactment of the post-9/11 Veterans Educational Assistance Improvements Act of 2010 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Miller, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Filner, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I rise today in support of the Senate amendment to H.R. 1383 as amended, the Restoring GI Bill Fairness Act of 2011. The bill will temporarily restore the post-9/11 GI Bill program's original method of paying tuition and fees to veterans attending private schools in several states. When the original post-9/11 bill was enacted, veterans were promised that VA would pay up to 100% of tuition and fees up to a state's most expensive in-state undergraduate tuition and fee charges at a public institution of higher learning. The state-based cap applied to veterans who chose both public and private schools. What this meant was that some veterans attending schools in certain states, that their tuition and fee payments could be well in excess of $20,000 annually. Veterans applied and enrolled in these schools based on the original promise. However, in an effort to fix some elements of the original GI Bill, Congress left those veterans in a bind. The post-9/11 Veterans Educational Assistance Improvement Act, which was enacted in January of 2011, made several changes. And one of those changes included a national cap of $17,500 on tuition and fee payments for veterans attending private schools, a change that will go into effect 1 week from today. For veterans that were enrolled in certain private schools in several states, including New York, Texas, Arizona, Michigan, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina, this change has real consequences. They will see their tuition and fee payments reduced by thousands of dollars. And, Mr. Speaker, I just don't think that's fair. We shouldn't change the rules on these veterans when they had already decided to attend the school of their choice and make financial decisions based on those rules. On May 23rd, the House unanimously voted to keep the original promise made to these veterans in H.R. 1383. The Senate has now acted on that bill, and we're ready to finish the job and send the bill to the President before these cuts can take place. Similar to the original House measure, the Senate amendment would temporarily restore the cap on tuition fees to the state-based method effective on August 1st, 2011. This increase would apply only to veterans who were enrolled in non-public institutions of higher learning that I mentioned previously before the 4th of January of 2011. In other words, they had to have already been enrolled on the 4th of January of this year, a change from the House-passed version, which was actually April 1st of 2011. Veterans who initially enrolled after January 4th of 2011 would be subject to the new cap. Mr. Speaker, it has come to our attention that some veterans are concerned about the January 4th eligibility date. We have talked with VA. They have assured us that any veteran who has applied and was accepted to a school on or before the 4th of January of 2011 will be covered under this particular bill that we are considering on the floor today. And veterans who applied or were accepted after that fact will be grandfathered under H.R. 1383. I believe VA's interpretation of the bill accurately reflects the House intent. So I would note that this bill was, as amended, passed the Senate unanimously, and of course it passed this body unanimously as well. At this time, I'd reserve the balance of my time and would encourage a positive vote by all my colleagues.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I also rise in support of H.R. 1383 as amended, and I thank Chairman Miller for the work he has done on the bill to make sure it was palatable in both the House and the Senate. Let me just say, though, for the record, the GI Bill updates which we passed last Congress were passed with the full support of virtually every veteran service organization in the nation, the majority of which submitted letters of support and strongly advocated for the bill, which included this tuition cap, which we have been talking about. Everyone was well aware of the effect of the tuition cap, so I was sort of surprised when these same folks started talking about what they called unintended consequences. I think everybody knew the consequences. I know that many of our veterans made plans about their education based on the laws in effect before they started. And while most states ended up getting an increase with the new national average, a few states also saw a decrease. It is in these states that H.R. 1383, as amended, seeks to hold harmless our veterans from the so-called unintended consequences of the tuition cap. Our veterans have indeed, as Chairman Miller pointed out, earned their education benefits, and I firmly believe that we should seek to avoid any actions that may interfere with the use of their benefits. I am pleased that we are here today taking action to alleviate this potential burden on a small population of these student veterans. The start of the new school year, of course, is right around the corner, so I hope that with our quick action today, we will have this issue solved in time for the new academic year. We have made quite a few changes to improve the so-called post-9/11 GI Bill, and more changes are still being contemplated. As a committee, as a Veterans Committee and as a Congress, we must continue to work hard to ensure future changes do not delay or diminish benefits. Veterans are our priority, and we will protect their interest. I have no further requests for time, Mr. Speaker, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida is
Mr. Speaker, we have no further speakers at this time. I would ask unanimous consent that all members would have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on the Senate amendment to H.R. 1383 as amended. And once again, I encourage all members to support my motion to concur with the Senate amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back, so ordered. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and concur with the Senate amendments to H.R. 1383? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this question will be postponed. The Chair lays before the House a message.
To the Congress of the United States, pursuant to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, I hereby report that I have issued an executive order declaring a national emergency with respect to the unusual and extraordinary threat that significant transnational criminal organizations pose to national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. Organized crime is no longer a local or regional problem. It has become a danger to international stability. Significant transnational criminal organizations have become increasingly sophisticated and dangerous to the United States, and their activities have reached such scope and gravity that they destabilize the international system. These groups have taken advantage of globalization and other factors to diversify their geographic scope and range of activities. They have increased and deepened their ties to governments in the international financial system, relying not only on bribery and violence, but also more and more on the ability to exploit differences among countries and to create and maintain legal facades to hide illicit activities. The specific harms that significant transnational criminal organizations threaten today are many. They corrupt and in many cases co-opt governments, thereby destabilizing them and weakening democratic institutions and the rule of law. They threaten U.S. economic interests by subverting, exploiting, and distorting legitimate markets, and could gain influence in strategic sectors of the world economy. significant transnational criminal organizations that engage in cybercrime threaten sensitive public and private computer networks, undermine the integrity of the international financial system, and impose costs on the American consumer. Those that engage in the theft of intellectual property not only erode U.S. competitiveness, but also endanger the public health and safety through the distribution of tainted and counterfeit goods. Many of them also engage in drug trafficking. Finally, significant transnational criminal organizations increasingly support the activities of other dangerous persons. The executive order I have issued today is part of a comprehensive strategy to address the growing threat of transnational organized crime. The order targets significant transnational criminal organizations and the networks that support them, striking at the core of those networks, their ability and need to move money. It does this by blocking the property and interests and property of foreign transnational criminal organizations. I have delegated to the Secretary of the Treasury the authority, in consultation with the Attorney General and the Secretary of State, to take actions, including the promulgation of rules and regulations, and to employ all powers granted to the President by IEEPA as may be necessary to carry out the purposes of the order. I am closing a copy of the executive order I have issued. Signed, Barack Obama, the White House.
Referred to the Committee on Foreign Affairs and ordered printed. The Chair will entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purposes does the gentleman from Colorado speak?
To address the House for 1 minute and advise the
So ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to an American hero. Not a hero in our typical sense of the word, but in the context of heroism that we have seen replicated across the face of this great nation. Today, Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to Terry R. Gorsuch. He was a man who embodied the characteristics that we rightly honor in our country. He worked hard, overcame adversity, and in business he innovated. He risked all, and by the grace of God and through perseverance, was rewarded with his successful company, Triab Western Constructors. The story could stop there, but he believed his greatest accomplishment and blessing in life was his family. Married to his loving wife, Rita, for 45 years, raising their 2 children, Tracy and Terry D., and then seeing their children grow to adulthood, Mary, and blessed the family with 2 grandchildren, Grayson and Jaden. Terry R. Gorsuch lived the American dream. He worked hard, played by the rules, loved his family, and always extended a helping hand to others. He could not win his final battle as he succumbed to Lou Gehrig's disease, but his admirable moral fiber held firm, even as the final sands of his time slipped from beneath his feet. We don't often reflect on the heroes who make this country work and help make this country what it is. But today, Mr. Speaker, I am proud to honor an American hero, Terry R. Gorsuch. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. Are there further requests for 1-minute speeches? The chair lays before the House the following personnel requests.
Leaves of absence requested for Mr. Baca of California for Friday, July 22nd. Mr. Berg of North Dakota for today. Mr. DeFazio of Oregon for today. Mrs. Napolitano for today until 5 p.m. and Mrs. Richardson of California for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this evening, the Congressional Black Caucus is pleased that our Democratic leadership has given us the opportunity to once again come to the floor for the first Democratic hour this evening. I want to just talk a little bit about some of the people who came and visited me in my office in my district this morning. I had a visit from AARP leadership and some of their advocates and volunteers this morning in my St. Croix office. They came to bring this petition to the office, signed by hundreds of people just on one of my islands. And it says, "Dear members of Congress, seniors and future retirees earn their benefits after a lifetime of hard work and paying into the system. Yet some members of Congress from both parties are considering harmful cuts to Medicare and Social Security." I know nobody in the Congressional Black Caucus is considering those kinds of cuts. As a part of a deal to pay the nation's bill, a deal that could dramatically increase health care costs for seniors and future retirees, threaten their access to donors, hospitals, and nursing homes, and reduce benefits checks they rely on to pay their bills. Instead of cutting the benefits of seniors and future retirees, Congress should be reducing wasteful spending and closing tax loopholes. Instead of shifting more health care costs to seniors, Congress should be working to hold down health care costs for everyone, as the Democrats worked very hard to do last year when we passed the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And so these undersigned are calling on us to oppose any deal that would make harmful cuts to the Medicare Social Security benefits Americans have been working on for all these years. And this is just the beginning, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. There'll be more of these petitions to come. Some of the participants that came to my office this morning are Aloma Peters, Lucy Rodriguez, Elizabeth Toruela, Nicholas Encarnacion, Luz de Sierra, Theodora Moorhead, Ann Thomas, Ellarine Batiste, Joan Saki, Miguel Ramos, Ramon Tacagnes, Doris Brown, Paul Simmons, Denise Singleton, Jenny Dargan, and Lumos Ayala, but representing the hundreds of people that sent this petition to the Congress of the United States. You know, in my district, and they talked about this morning, we have one of the highest utility bills in our country, and they're just trying to figure out what they would do if their Social Security checks were not coming to them next month. But, you know, a default is not just catastrophic for individuals on Social Security, it would be catastrophic for everyone. It's catastrophic for our nation and our economy. The poor, of course, would lose their safety net and the ability to pull themselves out of poverty, the help that they need. And the middle class will also pay a price. It would be so catastrophic that mortgage payments would increase by over $1,000 for the average family. Credit card interest would increase by $250 for the average family. Families could pay an additional $182 per year on utilities. I'm sure our utilities in the Virgin Islands would be much higher than that. And families could pay an additional $318 per year on food. They could lose thousands of dollars in their retirement savings. We are so proud and honored to have a leader like Leader Nancy Pelosi, who has represented us in all of the discussions at the White House and has stood strong for Democratic priorities and kept the voices of House Democrats and the interests of the American people on the table. We have heard of two different proposals that are coming forth this evening. It's interesting that Speaker Boehner has brought forth a proposal with still no tax hikes. We were never talking about tax hikes, Mr. Speaker. We were talking about letting the temporary Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans expire, as they were always intended to expire. His proposal speaks about entitled reforms and savings. I just read the letter from the AARP, the petition, at least in part, which calls on us to save Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Yet, the Republican proposal would include entitlement reforms and savings. And again, here comes the balanced budget amendment, a budget amendment that would be required before the end of the year. And then a short-term lifting of the debt ceiling, something that will not bring the stability to our economy and that would still put our credit in the world at risk. It says it's a two-step approach to hold President Obama accountable. Is that what this is all about? Or is it that we're trying to restore the good faith and credit of this nation? Their two-step approach to hold President Obama accountable? I don't think he needs to be held accountable. He's been a good president, and he doesn't need us to help him be accountable. They have cuts. They want cuts that exceed the debt hike, the hike in the debt ceiling. I think that's a new one. I thought originally we talked about having a balance between the lifting of the debt ceiling and the cuts. Caps to control future spending. Well, we know what that would mean. All of the programs that our communities, the communities that we represent, would lose funding for programs that they need. Again, here comes the balanced budget amendment, entitled reforms, and of course, no tax hikes. Now, I've been joined by several of my colleagues, and I'd like them to join in this special order if they are ready at this point in time. And I'm always pleased to be joined on these Monday evenings by the gentlelady from Houston, Texas, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. And we're glad to yield to her such time as she might consume.
I thank the gentlelady from the